I'm Father Gregory Pine, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this most recent episode of Off-Campus Conversations, where we seek to follow up with a Thomistic Institute speaker so as to pursue some of the lines of arguments and deepen some of the insights from a recent talk that would have been given on campus or at a conference or at an intellectual retreat. So for this installment, I'm very delighted to be joined by Professor Bruce Marshall. So Professor Marshall, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Father Gregory. Happy to be here.
All right. So many of our listeners will be familiar with you and with your work from the contributions that you've made at a handful of conferences or on-campus lectures. But for those who don't know you, would you just say a word of introduction, who you are, where you're from, and the work that you're involved in?
Absolutely. I am the layman professor of Christian doctrine at Southern Methodist University. I and my family are converts to Catholicism. We entered the church in 2005. So like some other Catholic theologians who were once Lutherans and now are Catholic Catholics and Catholic theologians, I teach in a non-Catholic setting and do my best to teach the faith and represent the church in that setting. I have a broad range of interests, including, of course, Trinitarian theology, which is our topic today, Christology, a special interest in the relationship of the church with the Jewish people and Judaism, among other things.
Okay, wonderful. I was present for a conference at which you contributed on the kind of legacy of the Yale School. So with Archbishop DeNoia and yourself and Professor Michael Root, and it was cool to think about this notion of a theological school, like an attentiveness to reading texts, a kind of hermeneutic stance, an appreciation for the church's scriptures and tradition. So that was very formative for me. So yeah, just a quick word of thanks on that before moving on to the subject of today, which is pursuant to a lecture that you gave at Oxford, the title of which was Medieval Answers to Modern Questions, Renewing Trinitarian Theology Today. So you gave the lecture about criticisms in the 20th and 21st century, sometimes lodged against the Western theological tradition, specifically St. Thomas Aquinas, when it comes to Trinitarian theology. And you laid out some of those arguments, and then you effectively refuted them, relying in part on Father Gilles Emery's work, who's my director. So I was glad to hear that. And then you went on to describe further, like, what needs to be done in the wake of that refutation, because people remain as yet unconvinced, or at the very least unconcerned, that their arguments have been refuted. And one thing I was struck by just in the beginning of your conversation, or beginning of your lecture, I should say, was this idea of like the way that an individual, a theologian, chooses to write his theology, right? So like, what do you start with? You introduce these different material and formal considerations. So like, how do you structure it? How much time do you devote to particular things? How do you make your point of entry? I guess you made the point, like St. Thomas Aquinas begins in one way in the Scriptum, and he begins in another way in the Summa Theologiae, just simply to say like, hey, we're not, you don't have to make every work of theology like comprehensive, wholly balanced. It's like you're going to have to focus sometimes. So I guess maybe expanding upon that particular consideration, how much do you think these debates regarding the material or like the formal structure of works of theology really get to the heart of the matter, or is this just like archaeology for those who are unwilling to do systematic or dogmatic theology and say?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter, Father Gregory. Several things. I mean, these are, not sort of flattering or positive comments about the state of contemporary Catholic theology, or Protestant theology as well, for that matter. But in the Catholic world, Karl Rahner's Trinitarian theology has had a very big influence. And Rahner actually didn't write that much on the Trinity. He was a hugely voluminous theological writer, but and wrote interestingly on many, many different topics. But he wrote one long essay on the Trinity, which then was published as a book in English. It was part of a much larger work a collected work in German. And he makes much of this idea that, St. Thomas did something, wrong and deeply problematic by putting, as Rahner calls it, the one God before the Trinity. But this has led Catholics, to have a kind of, herd mentality. I mean, I don't mean to be, too harsh, but, Rahner said it. And so, we've got a problem here, we got to do things differently. But why? I mean, what's the problem? As you suggested, you can't say everything at once. So why not order your theological work in a clearly set out way, so that your sort of principle of ordering is knowable and clear and stated up front. And so St. Thomas in the Summa Theologiae, which, as anyone who's familiar with St. Thomas, certainly including yourself, knows, the Summa Theologiae was a sort of special work that Aquinas undertook to get outside the genre of the sentences commentary, because he thought the sentences commentary, while it was something he had done in one of his major works, his first major work, the sentences commentary is not organized in the most helpful way for students. So, as he says very explicitly at the beginning of the Summa Theologiae, we want a more helpful ordering. And he's very clear that the ordering then is going to be one that is, first of all, pedagogically helpful. Those things that are easier to understand come before those things that are more difficult to understand. And secondly, it's going to be an ordering that is, broadly speaking, follows the order of our knowing, although that, has complexities and issues that arise on particular points. So the fact that he starts with the divine essence, and it starts in the sense of, this is where the book begins. I mean, this is where the Summa Theologiae begins, after he treats the science of sacred doctrine and its nature. He starts with the divine existence, and then the divine essence and its characteristics, properties, attributes. Because, first of all, elements of that are naturally knowable to us, and as such are easier for us to grasp. Not easy, but easier for us to grasp than the divine Trinity is, which is not naturally knowable to us, which requires special divine revelation for us to know it. So, at his passage in Rahner, where he's in his famous essay on the Trinity, or short book on the Trinity, where he says, St. Thomas put the De Deo Uno first, which is not what Aquinas calls it, but never mind. St. Thomas put the De Deo Uno first for reasons that have never been explained. And one sort of says, well, he explains it. I mean, he tells you why he's doing it. It's because, this is naturally knowable and therefore easier to understand than the divine Trinity, which can be grasped. It's the first and deepest of all the mysteries of divine revelation, but we can have a conceptual grasp of it within limits. But we need to know some things about the divine nature in order to grasp the Trinity with with the conceptual grasp that's available to us. Right? So there's no big mystery as to why, or puzzle as to why Aquinas set this up the way he did. It's a teaching tool. And as I mentioned, you pointed this out in your question. In his commentary on the scriptum, his commentary on the sentences, the scriptum as it's called, he says, I'm just going to follow the order of Peter Lombard. And Peter Lombard started with a bunch of questions on the divine persons and on the Trinity. He doesn't think that's wrong. He just thinks it's more helpful to go at it in a different way. So I think a lot of the difficulty here, Father Gregory, is that Catholic theologians have grown very used to doing theology in non-scholastic ways. And I'm not saying theology has to be scholastic, but I think that one of the advantages of scholastic theology is precisely this clarity that we don't try to say everything at once. We don't have to get all the important things out on the table right at the beginning. So one more observation about this. There's also been commentary, this is related to Christology, a lot of commentary that St. Thomas puts Christ at the end. And people say things like, well, he must not think Christ is that important. I mean, he must be kind of, an abstract theist because he puts Christ at the end. Whereas, Karl Barth, for example, or other theologians, Karl Barth, a very important 20th century Protestant theologian, they start right in with Christ, and so that's what you should do. You shouldn't wait till the end. Well, obviously Christ appears throughout the Summa Theologiae, but again, Thomas is very explicit. But what he's doing, he says, now we come at the very beginning of part 3. Now we come to the consummatio totus negotii theologiae. Okay, sorry to throw a little Latin in here. The consummation of the whole enterprise of theology, Christ. Okay, so the whole thing's been aiming at Christ. And Christ and his sacraments are the consummation, the fulfillment, the perfection, if you like, of the whole project of theology. So, again, he's very explicit about why he sets it up the way he does, and one naturally wonders, why do people regard this as mysterious? And even more, why do they regard it as a big problem? It's not that St. Thomas doesn't think Christ is important. He thinks you'll understand the importance of Christ best when you've understood some other things first.
Okay, I have a few thoughts pursuant to that description, and this is helping me also to think through things that I haven't organized in my own mind up until this point. So, on the one hand, okay, with respect to organization of the Summa questions, I'm probably just going to leave that to the side because you've got a lot of conversations about the exitus reditus schema, and then recently Father Cajetan Cuddy recovered and argued for a kind of exemplar, then image, then exemplar image setup of the Summa Theologiae, and he's really attentive there to the prologues of the different parts of the Summa, which argument I find very convincing. But I'm thinking here specifically about the mode of exposition and how the mode of exposition is accommodated to the learner. Okay, so he says it's for beginners,
right?
And there's much that's made of that. And but John Boyle has certainly helped to clarify what that entails or what that means. Like Dominican students with a background in the liberal arts who would have studied philosophy and have a modicum of mastery over the kind of propedeutic or antecedents. But also I'm thinking it's addressed to human beings more basically, and human beings, are time bound, and as a result of which their thought is discursive, right? There's antecedent and consequent features to it. So I'm thinking here about his clarification, the prima pars, I don't remember, question 12 or 13, talking about our manner of speech and the way in which that somehow complicates the way in which we predicate things of God. So you've got the thing that's said, the res significata, and then you've got the way it's said, the modus significandi. And it's fascinating, St. Thomas has an attentiveness to the fact that we think, to a certain extent, in time, and as a result of which, we're reading a text which is written in time, and we're reading it in time, and we're thinking in time, and as a result, you're going to have to choose your battles. And the reason I bring this up is because maybe that helps to bring into focus why certain 20th century and 21st century authors tend to prefer the poetic or the ecstatic or modes of discourse, which would be more like insight bursts rather than a more scholastic approach to things. And I'm thinking here of von Balthasar's reliance upon Adrian von Speyer. So I don't know, is there something to that? Am I off base? I haven't thought about this previously, so I'm having difficulty formulating it as a question, but do you see that in certain concilium or communio approaches versus a kind of older scholastic approach?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you're onto something that's quite important here. I like your phrase "insight bursts." I don't know whether that came to you as an insight burst, but I think it's a nice way to put it. And that can be the case with any of these very formative modern or recent Catholic writers like Rahner and Balthasar. They're often remarkably striking and insightful things they say. But St. Thomas points out in one of the questions you were referring to, precisely regarding why we have to make distinctions like the thing signified and the way we signify it. Why do we have to bother with those kinds of linguistic or conceptual questions? Because, just to quote him, the thing known is in the knower according to the mode of the knower. So we know whatever we know, from God to mud, we know as human beings, right? We know in a human mode. Now, the mode of our knowing can be perfected, and that perfection will take place ultimately in the beatific vision. But in our present state, the mode of our knowing is precisely, as you say, temporal, which means one thing has to come after another. And scholastic theology, I think, is just very helpful in not being against insight bursts, but thinking that part of insight is to be clearly organized, rather than sort of having to wade through, huge passages of prose, blizzards of words, to get the nugget that you're looking for. So yeah, I think that's an issue that is important, because obviously both Rahner and Balthasar and many other Catholic theologians who are influenced by them or were doing broadly similar things are concerned about doing Catholic theology in a way that addresses contemporary concerns, but also addresses contemporary listeners and readers. And contemporary readers of theology are typically not sort of well equipped to engage scholastic material. I mean, I view that as a kind of cultural deficit that Dominican friars like yourself don't have, especially those studying for doctorates in Fribourg, but Catholic theology, I think, more broadly tends to have. And I know this just from years of teaching, that it's much easier to teach a highly disorganized writer like Balthasar than it is to teach Aquinas, because people start reading it and it's too dense, it's too carefully put together, and they have trouble following. And it takes some education. And this is true not just of St. Thomas, of course, but of any sort of scholastically oriented theology. It takes some education to be ready to benefit from that. I think it's a really basic problem of contemporary Catholic theology that we need to not discard the other modes of discourse that you referred to, and there are many others as well, that of great modern saints like St. Therese, for example. I mean, she does not write as a scholastic. I mean, she doesn't just have bursts of insight, she has constant insight. So I'm not suggesting that this is the only mode of discourse, but especially Catholic theology as a university discipline, as an intellectual exertion in behalf of understanding the faith, I think really does needs to be able to recover a kind of more scholastic culture that can make sense of these kinds of texts more readily than we typically do.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the ways in which scholastic theology is described is as articulated, right? So it helps you to address the hinges of reality, because once you have a sense for the parts as articulated within a whole, then it's easier to reason from one to the other and back again, on account of the fact that you see, inter kind of relations among dependent causes, and you have a sense for like the intelligibility at stake. And so, so like people will say, like, once you've learned I've heard one person say that it takes about 10 years to learn St. Thomas well, but once you've done that, you can kind of live ad mentem divi tome, in the sense that you have a knack for what he would probably say, and then you come to discover that you're not too far off. It might depend in part on the patristic sources that he is recovering and the way in which they are engaging with sacred scripture, or he himself is engaging with sacred scripture. So that will obviously add particular like personal flavor to certain theological responses, but that you have this. Whereas, I've heard it said with certain 21st century authors, I'll just take it off the theological plane, just talk about Chesterton, for instance. I don't feel like I could ever live ad mentem divi Chestertoni, because it's so occasional, right? And it's very insightful at times, but it's a bit of everything, written by a man who was probably up till 2 a.m. facing a deadline at the Illustrated London Times, as he ate a mountain full of food so as to amuse his giggling nieces and nephews. So it's like you don't get the serene wisdom of a St. Thomas Aquinas. You just get these bursts of insight.
Right.
So maybe then, like, turning to the habit of mind, which would be better disposed to see reality as it is articulated, and to appreciate a theologian who tries to convey or translate some of that insight. What your experience in the classroom, perhaps, like, what are habits of mind and heart that you try to adduce in your students, so as to, like, impart some of the things that you would have learned from Lindbeck and Fry, like patience with text and attentiveness to the tradition.
Yeah. I appreciate you bringing it back, especially to Lindbeck, George Lindbeck, who was my teacher at Yale, was a very important figure he was a Lutheran theologian, who was an observer, a delegated observer at Vatican II. And he was a very important figure in my life and in Archbishop Denoya's life, as he described at that conference that you attended back in 2017. But I was very blessed, and I didn't know at the time how much of a blessing this was, that it was he who got me started reading St. Thomas. He was a medievalist by profession. When he did his doctorate at Yale in the early 50s, he studied in Paris with Paul Vigneault, wrote a dissertation on essentialism and existentialism in the doctrine of God and in relation to Scotus and St. Thomas, and so he was an unusual Lutheran in that he inhabited the scholastic world to a significant extent. I didn't realize how unusual that was until many years later. So I was very, very blessed and to have studied St. Thomas a lot before I became Catholic. Whoever it was that said you learned St. Thomas in 10 years must have been a Dominican, because had 10 years of Dominican life and daily study to learn it. I feel like I know St. Thomas fairly well, but it took me certainly more than 10 years of pretty steady engagement. But that's important. That one of the things I learned from Lindbeck initially, but then even more from St. Thomas, well, several things. One is just to read carefully, to pay close attention to the words, and to recognize that there aren't a lot of wasted words in an author like St. Thomas or any other great medieval scholastic theologian. It's very dense, carefully wrought discourse. And if theology, or Sacra Doctrina in St. Thomas's term, is to seek a deeper understanding of what God has taught us about the mysteries of his own life, as St. Thomas puts it in the first question, then the occulti actually says the secrets of his own life. Then, being careful both in writing and in reading, is really important. I think one of the frustrating things about a lot of more recent theology is that if the last paragraph wasn't that easily, that clear or that easily understood or that carefully argued, well, we'll just write another one, okay, and just keep going. And I think that makes for the theologian who's difficult to read in a very different and less helpful way. That is to say, not difficult because it's dense and substantive, but difficult because the theologian isn't clearly organized, isn't arguing carefully, isn't trying to write in a way that will repay close scrutiny. Okay, so that's one thing. Read the text very carefully. Another thing, this is really important for me with Lindbeck, and again, he saw St. Thomas as his sort of guide in this. Always understand a position that you think is wrong better than the person who's advocating. So you need to seek the most sympathetic reading of a position. If even, like Rahner's position on the Trinity, for example, you need to seek the most sympathetic reading of that position that you can come up with. Ideally, you need to make better arguments for that position than Rahner does, okay? And then disagree with it, okay? And he saw St. Thomas, Lindbeck, my teacher, saw St. Thomas as a master of this, that St. Thomas never scores cheap points against his, or rhetorical points against, his opponents or against those he's arguing with. He always seeks to put the best construction on a position before he makes a counter argument to it. And that seems to me to be a hugely important habit of mind for a theologian, and one that I wish were more sort of deeply inculcated in contemporary theology. And of course, part of the reason I feel that way is the amazing things people say about St. Thomas. That, did you read what he said? Did you actually look at the words? And even if you think he's wrong, all right, fine. But what do you understand his argument to be? Do you give me the best version you can of his argument before you start, disagreeing? So if the argument is simply, well, the questions on the one God come before the questions on the divine persons, the questions actually, in St. Thomas's own way of putting it, the questions on the divine essence come before the questions on the divine persons. Well, all right, that's true, but that's not an argument. That's just a sort of modest observation. So now what? Make an argument. Right? Tell me why this is an issue. And if you were St. Thomas, put yourself in his shoes. All right, if you disagree with him, if you were him, why would you say this? Okay, so same thing. Turn it around. All right, well, why does Rahner have the concerns that he does? In the lecture that you were prompted this discussion, I tried to say something about that. I'm very critical of Rahner in the end, but I want to sort of make it clear that he has some concerns that need to be addressed. But rather than seeing St. Thomas as an opponent, who needs to be overcome in order to address those concerns, he really ought to see St. Thomas as one who can address those concerns particularly well. For example, that the Trinity is at the heart of the entire Christian enterprise. The Christian life, Christian prayer, the liturgy, the whole enterprise of dogmatic theology, the Trinity is at the heart of the whole thing. And St. Thomas is actually clearer about that and more consistent about it than some of the contemporary Trinitarian theologians who criticize him.
Okay, so that comment and then an earlier comment prompt me to think a little bit about the liturgy. So you were talking about, the training that you had with Professor Lindbeck when it comes to paying attention to texts. And I'm thinking of a text from St. Thomas Aquinas. I think it's in the treatise on the virtue of religion. And he's describing how one kind of like enters into acts of liturgical worship. And he says, first, one marshals a kind of intention, which is to say, like one fixes the will on it as a desirable end. And then he says one proceeds to marshal attention, and he lines out like that we attend to the words, and through the words we attain to, the concepts, and through the concepts we attain to the things, which is a kind of typical semantic triangle.
Right.
But this idea that like through intention to attention, we attain to the very things themselves, right? It mediates a relationship with the reality. And then I'm thinking about, like the last thing that you described with the Trinity at the heart of the Christian life, and that theology, theological enterprises have a kind of doxological horizon. So maybe, like in your own work on this subject, in your own experience of these realities, like the Trinity as the source and the end of theology, does that give, like some resource to kind of like find our way through these problems, specifically in the context, of our liturgical life, of our life of worship?
Yeah. I think it certainly does. So the Eucharistic prayer, the Eucharist is the source and the summit of the Christian life. Liturgically speaking, I mean, that doesn't compete with the Trinity as the source and the summit of the Christian life. It's just in a different respect. It's the Eucharistic prayer is structured with great sort of Trinitarian clarity. And as Cardinal Ratzinger, as he then was, observes in his, I think, really remarkable and important book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, true liturgy isn't written, okay? You don't sit down, you don't send someone off or establish a committee, okay, now let's write a liturgy, okay? It emerges organically over time, and it develops. And it is quite astonishing that the canon of the Mass, for example, or what is now known as the first Eucharistic prayer in the Roman Missal, goes back as far as the 4th century. It's already in St. Ambrose in its essentially the form in which it existed then and still exists, 1,500, 1,600 years later. It is a prayer to the Father in the name of the Son and through the Son and in obedience to the Son, in conformity to his command, do this. And it invokes the Holy Spirit as the one whom Jesus will send to unite us to him, and through that union with him, which is realized in the Eucharist, which is accomplished in the Eucharist, we will be brought to the Father. So the Trinity is not, first of all, a sort of puzzling doctrine, right? And I think this is one of Rahner's worries, and that of other Catholic Trinitarian theologians who think we need to sort of get out of the scholastic mindset, is that scholasticism turns the Trinity into a kind of intellectual puzzle. As I said at one point in the lecture, a kind of jujitsu, that we do to sort of square the 3 and the 1, and I mean, that's a really important problem. I mean, that's absolutely central to Trinitarian theology. But way before that, much more sort of primitively or elementally or primally than that, the Trinity, the triune God, is the one who gives himself to us in the Eucharist in a very specifically ordered way. The Father, we call upon the Father to give us the gift of the Son by the action and grace of the Holy Spirit. The canon or the first prayer, the third prayer, I think make this remarkably clear. The second prayer is rather short, and so it's maybe a little less clear, but it's still there. I mean, the structure is still there. And Christian prayer then follows this basic pattern. What does Jesus say in the the so-called farewell discourse in the Gospel according to John, I will send the Spirit who will take what is mine and declare it to you, who will lead you into all truth. Well, what is the truth into which he leads us? It's himself. Okay, I am the truth. And as St. Thomas says, what is it for Jesus to be the truth? It's for him to be the truth of the Father. And it's for him to be the way in which the Father knows himself and all things he makes from all eternity is through the Son. So that's what the reality is. The res in Latin, or the res, the reality of the Trinity that is given to us in this very explicitly differentiated way in the Eucharist. So, I mean, there's a lot of other things one could say about this. I mean, it's the same. Sorry, I mean, I told you I might get too excited and knock my laptop off my Kleenex box here. But so, if one prays the Liturgy of the Hours or listens to the collects at the beginning of Mass, they're either prayers to the Father through the Son and in the name of the Son, or sometimes they're prayers to the Son who lives and reigns with the Father in the unity of the Holy Spirit. Okay? So that's the basic pattern of Christian prayer. Okay? Either to the Father in the Son or to the Son with the Father in the Holy Spirit. And Christians know this. Okay? I mean, people who are active as Christians, even if they have no, theological training or anything like that, they know how to pray. And they know how to call upon the Father the way the Church does in the Eucharist. So that to me is an important sort of antidote to the kind of worry that someone like Rahner has. He says, and I think I quoted this in the lecture, that Scholastic theology, or at least what he calls handbook or manual theology, which I think has a very undeservedly bad reputation. I could say more about that if you want. Scholastic or manual theology has turned Christians into mere monotheists, who have no sort of Trinitarian sense. Well, I'd say exactly the opposite, that they may not be able to give any kind of account of the Trinity, or they may think, it's like ice cubes and melting and turning into steam or something, which it most certainly is not. But they still know how to pray, and they go to Mass and they know what's happening in the Eucharist at some, I think, deep intuitive level. The burden of proof is on the idea that they don't know this. Okay. So, we shouldn't confuse the ability to articulate in a theologically precise way the content of the mystery with the ability to live within that mystery in a genuine and indeed quite profound way. I already mentioned St. Therese, right? If I had a sort of confusion about the Trinity and I asked her about it, I would follow whatever she told me to do. Okay. I mean, if she told me, don't stop thinking about this, I'd say, okay, I mean, or she said, you're thinking about this too much, do this instead. Absolutely. All right. Because she lived in the Trinity much more profoundly than I do. All right. She knew how to pray. And has, of course, shared that with the Church. Or St. Elizabeth of the Trinity is another wonderful embodiment of that. So all this is simply to say that the Trinity is, first of all, the mystery at the heart of Christian life and Christian worship, of the liturgy, of the Mass. And it's because the Trinity, the triune God, opens up his life to us in the Mass and in prayer, that we need to think about that in theology. And I think that's what St. Thomas is doing. Okay, you opened with a prayer of his. I think the recording might not have been on when you offered that prayer, but it's a prayer of any Christian heart. Help me to know you truly and to be attentive to what you teach. And that's first of all in worship and in prayer.
Okay, so thanks so much. I have maybe two concluding thoughts, and then I'll just send it back to you for a final word.
Okay.
But first, just a word of thank you for helping me and helping the listener to formulate this idea of kind of like theological charity or argumentative sympathy, because I think it's super helpful for overcoming certain problematics which beset 21st century discourse. But I think it's also super fruitful for just our sanctification, our ongoing conversion as Christians, because I think that it makes for object-oriented discourse rather than like mere polemics or controversy. Sometimes we define our position by contrast to the other when we haven't actually inquired into the nature of things. But one must, one absolutely. So I'm thinking about, von Balthasar. I've been encouraged by Father Gilles to read widely not this semester, but next semester, because there are going to be certain delays when, you're trying to deposit a thesis, which is basically done, but you have to like typeset something every 2 days. So he's like, get yourself a modicum of mastery and something parallel to, but which will enrich your appreciation of the matter at hand. And so, that's super helpful for me.
Good.
The other thing too, just another word of thank you, is like the vindication of the theological capacity of all Christians. I read the article that you wrote, Quicid una vetula, this idea that by faith one can genuinely know by participation in the knowledge of God and in the blessed. And your descriptions of Saint Therese and Saint Elizabeth of Trinity testify to that. So I think that just lies very close to the heart of the mission of the Thomistic Institute. It's not conquest or dominion. The point is ultimately to mediate a knowledge and love of God for all those who would approach him. So, it's good. So I leave kind of the floor to you for if you have any final thoughts or final reflections, and then just by way of conclusion, if you could maybe just direct the listener to places where they can find some of your titles and some of your articles, which might be pertinent to the subject.
Okay. Just to follow up a little personal comment about the habit of charity and discourse. We talked about my teacher, George Lindbeck. He pounded that into me. Okay. I was not inclined, I was inclined to be more polemical. And thanks be to God. He just wouldn't have it, and I remember turning in my first chapter of my dissertation, and he said, he thought the argument was pretty good, although it needed some work, but you have not done justice to Rahner here. I think I agree with you, but you've got to go back and do more justice to Rahner. And I'm not going to accept this if you don't. All right. So, he didn't put it quite that bluntly. He was a rather understated guy, but it was very clear. It was very clear. And, it sunk in, and my own students have, kindly said to me that is also, something I've passed on then to them. So I agree with you completely. It's just so important to, especially for contemporary theology, but also in the polemicized and conflicted contemporary world, that we have an object-oriented, or if you prefer, a reality-oriented discourse where we can together seek a deeper understanding of the realities that matter the most, instead of a defining of ourselves over against. I think that's just hugely important. I am working as we speak on a book on faith and reason, which will build on some of the articles that you mentioned. So you mentioned the piece that came out some years ago, which had a Latin title, Quocit una vetula, which is taking off from St. Thomas, who says in a remarkable passage that the theology, or Sacra Doctrina in his precise term, is an intellectual enterprise. This is my paraphrase of what he says, that simply attempts to capture or recapture, would be a better way to put it, in the mode of conceptual and precise discourse, what any old woman, any vetula, that's Latin for old woman, old crone, knows if she's a faithful Catholic. So theology is really beholden to the faith of the illiterate, St. Thomas's, cleaning lady. Okay, I mean the illiterate Neapolitan folks that he gave his sermons on the creed to probably toward the end of his life. It's their faith that that we share and that we try to understand theologically. And so the book I'm writing is called The Primacy of Christ, Faith, Reason, and the Cross. And it includes a kind of expanded version of that article you mentioned, and some other articles that I've written on faith and reason, on the Trinity in relation to faith and reason. It's going to be published by William B. Erdman's, an important theological publisher that has also published other Catholic writers like Khaled Anatolios and Fritz Bauerschmidt. God willing, that'll be out sometime next year. So that would be a good place to look. In fact, my two of my former students urged me strongly to do this because they said people can't find your articles. They have to go look in obscure places. So put them into a book. But I'm too much of a perfectionist. From also part of my heritage with my teachers that we've talked about. So I couldn't just sort of compile them. I had to say, no, I got to do more work on them. But these two former students, Adam Benward at Ave Maria and David Moser, who teaches up in Iowa, they're saying, no, we're giving you deadlines. Okay, you have to get these to us, and we'll work through them and make sure they get out. So that book, I hope, will be out about a year from now.
Wonderful, great. Well, I will look forward to reading that, and I'll look forward to future conversations, hopefully at Thomistic Institute conferences and in days to come. Turning then to the listener, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Off-Campus Conversations. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the Thomistic Institute podcast, whether on your podcast app or on YouTube, so that way you get updates when future things come out on the channel. Know of our prayers for you. Please pray for us in our theological work and our lives beyond, and then we'll look forward to chatting with you next time on the Thomistic Institute podcast. Cheers.